Margaret Calloway stood in the overgrown driveway of 14 Sycamore Hollow Road and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. The particular bone-deep cold of a woman who has nothing left to lose. She was 64 years old, recently retired, recently widowed in spirit if not in law, and holding a single rusted key that her dead sister had left her in a will that had made an entire family laugh out loud in a lawyer's office. Behind her, the Tennessee wind moved through the tall grass like a whisper she could not quite make out. Ahead of her stood the forgotten guest house, sagging shutters, cracked window panes, a porch that tilted like it was trying to bow out of existence. And all around her, the quiet, suffocating weight of a secret that had been buried for nearly 40 years. No one in that lawyer's office had understood what Eleanor Calloway Whitfield had actually hidden inside those rotting walls. Not furniture, not old clothes, not the worthless junk of a lifelong past. What Ellie had hidden was the truth, the whole devastating, legally explosive truth about where the Whitfield family fortune had actually come from. A truth she had spent nearly 4 decades too frightened to speak aloud. A truth she had finally decided to leave for the one person she trusted completely, her older sister. And that truth was about to change everything. Margaret Calloway was born in 1960, the first daughter in a 2-girl household on the quiet side of Cloverdale, Tennessee. Her father fixed pipes for a living. Her mother taught 3rd grade at the elementary school on Birch Street and came home every afternoon smelling of chalk dust and patience. They were not poor in the way that makes newspaper stories, but they were modest in the way that shapes a person permanently, the way that teaches a child early that nobody is coming to rescue you, so you had better learn to rescue yourself. Maggie learned. She learned it the way certain children do not, through dramatic revelation, but through steady observation. She watched her father crawl under sinks in January with a flashlight clenched between his teeth. She watched her mother grade papers until midnight and never once complain about it at breakfast. And she absorbed from both of them a principle that would define the rest of her life. You do the work in front of you. You do it completely, and you do not wait for someone to tell you that you are brave for doing it. She became a nurse. Not because she romanticized caregiving or because she had some calling that arrived in a shaft of light. She became a nurse because she discovered at 21 that she was unusually good at being in rooms with people who were in pain without panicking herself. She could hold steady when others could not. She could read a situation, a body, a silence, and know what it meant before anyone else in the room had finished processing what they were seeing. It was a skill that could not be taught. And over 40 years of 12-hour shifts and difficult conversations and rooms where she had to deliver news that no one wanted to hear, it had become the defining architecture of who she was. She married Frank Calloway when she was 28. Frank was a mechanic. He had hands that were never fully clean and a voice that could go an entire Sunday afternoon without saying more than 6 words, and every single one of those words meant exactly what it said. He loved her the way certain quiet men love, not with declarations or grand gestures, but with presence, with the reliable fact of himself showing up every single day and doing the next right thing. They had built a life that was not glamorous but was deeply sound, a house with a paid-off mortgage, 2 children raised with enough structure to be steady and enough freedom to be kind, a marriage that worked the way good marriages work, not because it was easy, but because both people in it had decided independently and without discussion that they were going to keep choosing it. Frank died in 2021, pancreatic cancer, 7 months from diagnosis to funeral. Maggie had nursed him herself through every stage, adjusting IV lines in their bedroom, managing pain medication with the same clinical precision she had brought to strangers for 4 decades, and holding his hand in the final hours with a steadiness that was not performance. It was simply who she was. She did not fall apart when he died. She absorbed it. Grief in Maggie's experience was not something you processed. It was something you took into your body slowly over time, the way old wood absorbs weather. You let it happen. You trusted that you would still be standing when it was done. She was still standing. Their daughter Sarah was 38 now, a school teacher in Nashville who called every Sunday evening and always asked if Maggie was eating enough, which was Sarah's way of asking if she was surviving without saying the word out loud. Their son Kevin was 35, married father of two small children, living 2 hours from Cloverdale in a house he had built with his own hands, because he was Frank's son in every way that mattered. Both of them had worried more since Ellie died. Maggie was alone in Cloverdale now. No husband, no sister. Just the quiet house and the paid-off mortgage and the particular silence that gathers around a woman who has outlived everyone she started with. Eleanor Calloway was born in 1962, 2 years after Maggie, and from the very beginning she had been a different kind of person. Where Maggie observed, Ellie felt. Where Maggie assessed a room before entering it, Ellie walked in hoping the room would be kind. She was softer than her older sister, in ways that their mother called sensitive, and their father called tender, and that Maggie, who loved her fiercely and protectively, from the first day she saw her in their mother's arms, simply called Ellie. She had always wanted to be loved, not in the way that everyone wants to be loved. The general human hunger for connection, but in a specific, almost desperate way that Maggie had recognized early and worried about often. Ellie did not just want someone to care about her. She wanted someone to choose her definitively and completely in a way that could not be taken back. And she had never quite learned how to demand that out loud. She asked for love the way shy people ask for things sideways, with her actions, with her availability, with the quiet hope that someone would notice what she needed without her having to name it. In the spring of 1984, Ellie was 22 years old and working as a bookkeeper for a small property management firm in Cloverdale. She was competent at it, detail-oriented the way people are when they channel their anxiety into precision, and she had settled into the modest rhythm of a young woman who had not yet figured out what she wanted her life to look like, but was content to keep showing up while she worked it out. Russell Harding walked into the firm's office on a Tuesday in April. He was 39 years old, a quiet, methodical man who owned 11 rental properties across 3 counties, and who came to the firm because his previous bookkeeper had retired, and someone had told him the Cloverdale office was reliable. He was not flashy. He was not the kind of man who entered a room and rearranged the air around himself. He wore plain clothes and spoke in complete sentences and looked at people when they talked to him with the full weight of his attention, which was, in Ellie's experience, a rarer quality than it should have been. They did not fall in love quickly. Russell was careful by nature, and Ellie was careful by fear, and the combination meant that what grew between them grew slowly, the way certain plants grow in shade, not reaching for the sun but deepening their roots. He began requesting her specifically when he came to the office. She began finding reasons to linger when he was there. And over the course of several months, what had started as professional courtesy became something that neither of them had the vocabulary to describe, but both of them recognized with absolute certainty. They were together for nearly a year, a quiet, careful relationship conducted mostly in private because Russell was a private man, and because Ellie, still young and unsure of herself, had not yet learned how to claim the things she wanted where other people could see. She loved him. She wrote about it later in a way that made the fact plain on every page, in the particular way people write about love when they are not performing it for anyone, plainly, exactly, without ornament. He had looked at her. She wrote like she was the answer to a question he had spent years trying to formulate. Then Warren Whitfield arrived. Warren came to the property management firm on business in the autumn of 1984. He was 37 years old, the son of Harlan Whitfield, whose name was on buildings and boards, and the lips of everyone in Cloverdale who considered themselves someone. Warren had inherited not just his father's money, but his father's particular certainty, the kind of confidence that fills a room so completely it leaves no space for anyone else's doubt. He noticed Ellie immediately. and he pursued her with the focused, systematic attention of a man who was accustomed to acquiring things he decided he wanted. He was charming. He was persistent. He arrived with flowers when she did not expect them, and with attention she had not asked for, and with a version of himself so polished and so certain that it seemed to a 22-year-old woman who had spent her whole life hoping someone would choose her completely, like the answer to every question she had ever been afraid to ask. She did not understand yet the difference between a man who loved her and a man who wanted to own her. She would learn that difference later, at a cost that would take her the rest of her life to calculate. She ended things with Russell, quietly, painfully, the way necessary endings always are. And she married Warren Whitfield in the summer of 1986, in a ceremony at the Cloverdale Baptist Church that their mother called the happiest day of her life. Maggie had stood beside her sister in a pale blue dress and smiled for the photographs and said nothing about the feeling she had carried in her chest since the engagement was announced. She had told herself it was just protectiveness, an older sister's irrational worry. She had told herself that Warren Whitfield was exactly what he appeared to be. She had been wrong. The will was read on a Thursday afternoon in the offices of Draper Kimball and Associates on Main Street in Cloverdale. Ellie had been gone for 3 weeks. A long illness, the kind that gives you time to prepare and then teaches you that preparation is an illusion. Maggie had sat beside her sister's hospital bed for the final 4 days, watching the monitors and holding her hand, and doing what she had done for 40 years in rooms where there was nothing left to do but be present. The lawyer's office was small and warm and smelled faintly of carpet cleaner. Warren Whitfield sat in the center of the front row with the posture of a man who already knew what was coming. Tyler and Jenna sat flanking their father. Tyler at 36 with his father's jawline and his father's way of taking up more space than necessary. Jenna at 34 with her mother's quiet eyes and her mother's habit of looking at her hands when the room felt too heavy. They had grown up in Warren's orbit, shaped by his gravity, pulled into the version of the family story that he had written and maintained for decades. They loved their mother, but they loved her at a distance that Warren had carefully cultivated, the distance of a man who understood that closeness between a wife and her children is only useful when it does not threaten his authority. Maggie sat in the second row. She had come alone. Sarah had offered to drive down from Nashville, and Kevin had offered to take the day off, and she had told both of them the same thing, that she would be fine, that will readings are administrative, not emotional, that she would call them afterward and tell them everything. The lawyer read the document in a measured professional tone that treated the dismantling of a woman's life as a series of legal paragraphs. The house on Crestwood Drive went to Warren. The savings accounts, the investment portfolio, the land holdings across 2 counties, all of it went to Warren. Everything Ellie had lived inside of, everything that bore her name on the paperwork, passed in clean legal language to the man she had married 38 years ago and had spent nearly all of those years quietly enduring. Then the lawyer reached the final bequest. To my sister Margaret Calloway, he read, I leave the guest house property at 14 Sycamore Hollow Road, Cloverdale, Tennessee, together with all contents therein and the enclosed key. Warren Whitfield laughed the loudest. The sound filled the small office the way his presence filled every room, completely leaving no space for anything else. His hand came up to pat his silk tie, a gesture so practiced it was almost involuntary, the gesture of a man who has already won and wants everyone to see that he knows it. Maggie gets the shack. He did not bother to lower his voice. Ellie always did have a sense of humor. Tyler's mouth twitched in something that was not quite a smile, but was close enough. Jenna looked down at her hands. The lawyer paused, glanced at Maggie, and continued with the remaining procedural language, as if the room had not just laughed at a dead woman's last wishes. Maggie sat very still. She looked at the rusted key in the small envelope the lawyer's assistant had placed in her hand. She looked at it for a long time, and she understood something that no one else in that room was equipped to understand. Ellie had not given her the broken piece, the leftover, the thing nobody wanted. Ellie had chosen her, deliberately, specifically, with the focused intention of a woman who had spent nearly 40 years carrying something too heavy and too frightening, and had finally, in the last act of her life, placed it in the hands of the one person she believed would know what to do with it. Maggie did not laugh. She did not cry. She put the key in her coat pocket and sat through the rest of the reading with the same expression she had worn in every difficult room for 40 years. Calm, attentive, already assessing. She spent the first week after the will reading doing nothing about it. She went home to her quiet house and watered her plants and ate soup she did not taste and let herself grieve her sister in the wordless way she had learned to grieve since Frank. Just sitting with it, not trying to make it smaller or neater than it was. But the key sat on her kitchen table the entire week. She could not put it in a drawer. Every time she tried something, stopped her hand halfway. The key was the last thing Ellie had chosen to give her. Putting it away felt like putting her sister away, and she was not ready for that. She was not sure she would ever be ready for that. Sarah called on Sunday evening right on schedule. "Mama, are you eating?" Maggie said she was eating fine. Kevin called on Monday, which was not his usual day, which meant Sarah had told him to check in. Maggie told him she was fine too. She told both of them about the guest house with the casual brevity of someone describing something that did not matter much. And they had both responded with the sympathetic confusion of children who loved their mother, but did not yet understand what she was carrying. On the 8th day, Maggie put the key in her coat pocket, got in her car and drove to Sycamore Hollow Road. The driveway was barely visible from the road. Weeds had swallowed the gravel almost completely, and the old gate that Harlan Whitfield had installed at the entrance had long since rusted off its hinges and lay flat in the tall grass like a fallen soldier. Maggie parked at the road and walked in. Her sensible shoes found uncertain ground beneath the overgrowth. The oak trees were enormous now, their roots buckling the remnants of the path, their branches so thick overhead that even in November, when they were bare and skeletal against the gray sky, they gave the impression of a tunnel, a passage into something older and quieter than the road behind her. The wind moved differently under the oaks, slower, heavier, as if the air itself remembered things that the rest of the world had forgotten. Then the guest house came into view, and Maggie stopped walking. She had not seen it up close in 30 years, maybe more. What she saw now was the ruin of something that had once had dignity. The porch sagged so severely on one end that the railing had snapped clean and lay in a heap below like bones. The shutters on the two front windows hung at angles that suggested they were only still attached out of stubbornness, not structural integrity. The siding, which had once been painted a clean cream color, was gray and soft with rot peeling away in strips that curled like old paper left in the rain. The roof over the porch had partially collapsed, and a tree branch had pushed its way through the gap and simply stayed there bare and unapologetic, as if it had decided this was its house now and did not intend to be corrected. The front yard was a tangle of dead blackberry canes and old field grass that came up past Maggie's knees. Somewhere under all of it, she could just make out the ghost of a stone path that had once led from the gate to the porch steps. The stones were still there, she could feel them under her feet, but they had been swallowed so completely by the earth and the grass that they existed now only as a memory of direction. She stood there for a long time, just looking. The wind moved through the oak trees. A crow called from somewhere behind the house. And the creek, she could hear it faintly. Still running, still there, still going even after everything else had stopped. Maggie Calloway was 64 years old. She was a retired nurse. She had lost a husband and a sister and had kept standing both times. She looked at the broken porch and the rotting walls and the collapsed roof, and she did something that surprised her. She laughed. Not bitterly, not with despair, just the plain, clear laugh of a woman who recognized in the wreckage in front of her a challenge she was absolutely going to accept. The laugh of someone who has spent a lifetime walking into rooms that other people were afraid to enter, and who has learned that the thing that looks the worst is not always the thing that will break you. Sometimes it is the thing that will show you what you are made of. She walked up to the front door, put the rusted key in the rusted lock, turned it, and the door opened. The smell hit her first. Mildew and damp wood and the ghost of something that had once been a home. Old fabric, old dust, old life. It was a smell Maggie recognized from certain hospital rooms, the smell of a space that has been closed too long with too much left inside it. The windows were so thick with grime that the November light barely made it through, casting the sitting room in a grey underwater haze that made everything look like it was slowly dissolving into itself. The room was not empty. That surprised her. She had expected bare floors and stripped walls, the hollow indifference of a space that had been cleared out and abandoned. Instead, the sitting room was still occupied by the ruins of furniture that no one had cared enough to remove. A sofa against the far wall had surrendered its shape, entirely cushions black with mold, and collapsed inward. A wooden side table near the window leaned at a defeated angle where one leg had given way. On the floor, a braided rag rug, once colorful, now the uniform gray of everything else, had been eaten through at its center by moisture and time. On the walls, rectangles of slightly less faded paint marked where pictures had once hung, their ghosts still visible in the pattern of the wallpaper, like memories that refused to leave completely. She moved through the sitting room into the narrow hallway beyond. To her left, a small bedroom with a rusted iron bed frame standing in the center. Mattress, long gone springs exposed and oxidized into the color of dried blood. To her right, the kitchen. She pushed open the kitchen door and stood for a moment in what had once been the room with the yellow tiles. Half of them were still there. The other half had fallen from the walls and lay on the counter and floor, in irregular piles like broken teeth after a fight. The ones that remained were cloudy with mineral deposits and grime, but she could see the yellow beneath. A warm, stubborn yellow that had not entirely given up. The color of something that refuses to stop being what it is, no matter how long it has been ignored. The kitchen window above the sink was intact, one of the few unbroken windows in the house. And through it, Maggie could see the creek closer than she had realized, moving through the trees, not 30 yards from the back door. It was shallow and clear, and it moved with the unhurried persistence of water that has been traveling the same path for longer than anyone alive can remember. She stood there looking at it for a long moment, letting the sound of it settle into the silence of the house. Then she heard the car. It came down Sycamore Hollow Road slowly, the way cars move when their drivers are looking for something specific. Maggie walked back through the house and stepped onto the sagging porch just in time to see Warren Whitfield's silver Mercedes stop at the end of the driveway. He did not pull in. He sat with the engine running. Window down, looking at the guest house with an expression that Maggie could read clearly, even from 50 feet away. Not concern, not curiosity, satisfaction. He had come to watch. She understood that immediately with the clarity of a woman who had spent 4 decades reading faces in rooms where the truth was not spoken aloud, but was always visible if you knew where to look. He had heard through whatever channels Warren Whitfield used to monitor the lives of people he considered beneath him, that Maggie had come to look at her inheritance. And he had driven out to Sycamore Hollow Road to see her face when she saw it, to confirm with his own eyes that she had nothing worth having. Maggie stood on the broken porch and looked at him. She did not look away. She did not go back inside. She stood straight, the way she had stood in difficult rooms for 40 years. The rooms where you told families their father was not going to wake up. The rooms where a young mother learned that the test results were not what she had hoped. The rooms where you had to be the steadiest person present because someone had to be, and no one else was volunteering. Warren leaned out the window. "Nice place, Maggie." His voice carried easily in the cold November air, wrapped in the particular warmth of a man who is enjoying himself at someone else's expense. Ellie always did have a sense of humor. He smiled. It was the smile of a man who had never once in his life been told that he was wrong about something important, and who had therefore concluded with the unshakable certainty of the deeply fortunate that he was incapable of being wrong. "You can still sell it to me, you know. I will give you 15,000 for it. More than it is worth. Consider it a favor." Maggie looked at him for a long moment across the overgrown yard, across the fallen gate, across the distance between a man sitting in a $90,000 car and a woman standing on a porch that was trying to collapse beneath her. Then she said clearly, and without heat, the way she said everything that mattered, "I will be in touch, Warren." She turned and walked back inside the house. She heard his window go up. She heard the Mercedes reverse and pull away. She heard the engine fade down Sycamore Hollow Road until there was nothing left but the wind and the creek and the settling sounds of a house that had been holding its breath. She stood in the dim hallway and breathed slowly and deliberately, the way she had taught anxious patients to breathe when the world felt like it was closing in. In through the nose, out through the mouth, steady, measured. The breathing of someone who is not panicking and does not intend to start. She was not going to sell. She had known that before she had gotten out of the car. But it was not stubbornness that held her here. It was not pride. It was something she had not expected to feel the moment she stepped through the door. A pull. Something beneath the mold and the decay and the broken tiles, some quality of this specific place that felt almost like a voice. Like the house itself was trying to tell her something it had been waiting a very long time to say. She thought of Ellie, the way her sister had spoken about this place over the years, never directly, never with any real information, but always with that particular guarded expression that Maggie now recognized standing here in the gray light and the mildew smell as the expression of someone who knows exactly what a place contains and has chosen for reasons of their own not to say so. There was something here. Maggie could feel it the way she had once felt a patient's hidden pain before any test confirmed it. A clinical intuition bone deep and certain, the kind of knowing that comes not from evidence but from decades of paying attention to things that other people overlook. She pulled out her phone, turned on the flashlight, and began to look. She started in the sitting room, methodically, the way she had always approached a difficult task, not with urgency, but with patience. She moved the collapsed sofa away from the wall, dragging it inch by inch across the pine floor, checking behind it. Nothing but a dark rectangle of cleaner wall and a single rusted nail. She opened the narrow closet near the hallway. 3 wire hangers, a mouse nest long abandoned, and a smell that made her step back. She moved to the bedroom. The iron bed frame caught her attention first. It was bolted to the wall on one side, which was not how bed frames worked. Most bed frames stood on their own legs. This one had a bracket drilled directly into the wall studs, heavy-duty, deliberate, as if whoever had placed it there wanted to make absolutely certain it never moved. As if its position was not a matter of convenience but of concealment. She knelt on the floor and looked underneath. Dust. Old insulation crumbled from somewhere above. A single button bone white. Nothing else. She stood and looked at the bracket on the wall for a moment, thinking. Then she looked at the floor beneath the bed and her attention narrowed. The floorboards were the same old pine as the rest of the house, running in parallel lines toward the far wall. But in the corner diagonally opposite the bracket, something was different. 2 boards ran perpendicular to the rest. A small section, maybe 2 feet square, that someone had laid in a different direction from every other board in the room. It was the kind of detail that most people would never notice. But Maggie was not most people. She had spent 40 years noticing things that other people overlooked, and the pattern break was as clear to her as a wrong note in a familiar song. She crouched closer and saw it. Layers of paint, coat after coat after coat, laid down over years until the seam between the perpendicular boards and the rest of the floor was nearly invisible. But the paint had cracked and yellowed with time, and in the cracks she could see that the gap beneath was not the natural settling of old wood. It was deliberate, clean cut. Someone had cut those boards on purpose and then spent considerable effort making sure nobody would notice. She took the small pocket knife she kept on her keychain. 40 years as a nurse had taught her to always have something sharp within reach. Not out of paranoia, but out of the practical understanding that the world regularly presents situations where a blade is the difference between helplessness and action. She dragged it along the seam, The paint crumbled away in thin flakes, falling onto the floor like dead skin. She sat back on her heels and looked at what she had revealed. A clean, intentional cut in the floorboards, a hidden seam, a space beneath the floor that someone had constructed deliberately and concealed with decades of patience. Her heart picked up its pace. She recognized the feeling from certain moments in her nursing career. The specific alertness of a person who has just understood that what they are looking at is important, that the next few minutes are going to change the shape of everything that comes after. She went to her car and came back with a flathead screwdriver from the small toolkit Frank had kept in the trunk. She had never removed it. Removing it would have felt like erasing him, like declaring that the space he had occupied in her life was now available for something else, and it was not. Some absences are permanent. Some tools stay where they are, because the person who put them there still matters more than the space they take up. She worked the blade into the seam and applied careful, steady upward pressure. The section of floor resisted. It resisted the way things resist when they have not been disturbed in a very long time, with the stubborn weight of years pressed into every fiber. But it lifted. Slowly, reluctantly, it lifted. Beneath was a shallow cavity, roughly 2 feet square and about 8 inches deep. Not a full cellar, not a room, just a hidden pocket deliberately constructed, deliberately concealed, holding 3 things that had been waiting in the dark for decades. The first was a large manila envelope sealed with wax that had dried to the color of old blood. The second was a small notebook with a cover of dark green cloth, its spine intact, its pages swollen slightly with age but not destroyed. The third was a photograph, loose face down, tucked under the notebook as if placed there last and pressed flat with intention. Maggie sat very still. The cold of the floor came up through her coat and into her bones. The creak moved outside the kitchen window. A branch tapped once against the side of the house in the wind and then went quiet, as if even the trees understood that this was not a moment for interruption. She picked up the photograph first. She turned it over. It was a picture of Ellie. Young Ellie, maybe 22, which would have placed the photo in 1984. She was sitting at a table Maggie did not recognize, in a room Maggie did not recognize, and across the table from her sat a man who was not Warren Whitfield. He was older than Ellie by perhaps 15 years, broad-shouldered with dark hair going gray at the temples, and an expression on his face that Maggie could only describe one way: the expression of a man who is entirely, devastatingly in love. His hand rested on the table close to Ellie's, not touching, but close enough that the intention was unmistakable. On the back of the photograph, in Ellie's handwriting, loopy and left-leaning, the handwriting of a woman who had been told as a girl that her penmanship was too large and had never once corrected it, were 4 words: "Before I was afraid." Maggie set the photograph down carefully on the floorboard beside her. She opened the green notebook. The first page was written in the same hand but steadier, more deliberate, as if Ellie had taken her time with every word and understood that what she was committing to paper could not be revised or taken back. "My name is Eleanor Calloway Whitfield. I am writing this in 1989 because I need someone to know the truth, even if I am too frightened to say it aloud. If you are reading this, then I have finally found the courage I spent my whole life looking for. Or I have run out of time to find it. Either way, the truth is here, all of it. Read carefully. It matters more than you know." Maggie read for 2 hours without moving. The light through the kitchen window shifted from afternoon to the flat gray of early evening. The temperature dropped and she did not notice. Her back stiffened against the cold floor, and she did not adjust. She read every page of that green notebook with the same focused attention she had brought to every critical chart, every urgent lab result, every piece of information that carried the weight of someone's life inside it. Ellie had met Russell Harding in the spring of 1984. She was 22 years old, working as a bookkeeper. He was 39, a quiet man who owned 11 rental properties across 3 counties. The notebook told their story in the particular way that people write about love, when they are not performing it for anyone, without drama, without embellishment, with the plain, honest clarity of a woman looking back at the one true thing in her life and wanting to get it right. Then the notebook's tone changed. The handwriting tightened. The sentences grew shorter. Warren Whitfield had used his position on the Cloverdale County Planning Board, a position he had obtained through connections and financial contributions that Ellie's notebook documented with meticulous precision to engineer a series of zoning reclassifications targeting Russell Harding's properties. 11 rental properties across 3 counties reclassified as non-conforming overnight, unable to rent them legally, unable to sell them at anything approaching their real value while the reclassifications were under dispute. Russell had been strangled financially with surgical patience until he had no choice but to sell every single property for a fraction of what it was worth. And who had bought them? Through a series of holding companies and shell entities that Ellie had spent years quietly tracing, connecting names and addresses and filing dates with the painstaking thoroughness of a bookkeeper who understood exactly what numbers could reveal. When you followed them far enough, the answer was Warren Whitfield. 11 properties acquired through manufactured regulatory ruin, the seed capital, the foundation, the actual origin of everything the Whitfield family real estate portfolio had become over the following decades. Ellie had discovered this 3 years into her marriage in 1989, when she found documents in Warren's home office filing cabinet that she was not meant to see. Tyler was 1 year old. She was pregnant with Jenna. She was living inside a life that had already closed around her like a fist, and she had just learned that the man who controlled every aspect of that life had built his fortune on the deliberate destruction of the man she had loved before him. She had calculated her options with the merciless clarity of someone who has no good ones. Warren controlled the money. Warren's name was on buildings and boards and the lips of everyone who mattered in Cloverdale. She had a 1-year-old son and a baby on the way and no income of her own, and no one she could safely tell. She had understood with the cold precision of a woman who was smarter than anyone in her life had ever given her credit for, that there was no safe way to use what she knew. Not then, not yet. So she had done what frightened people do with unbearable knowledge. She had hidden it. She had written it down in a green notebook. She had collected evidence over years quietly, carefully, at considerable personal risk. She had hired a private investigator in 1995 who traced the shell companies back to Warren with documentary precision. She had obtained a signed notarized statement from Russell Harding himself in 1997, confirming everything describing what had been done to him and acknowledging that he had never been able to pursue legal action because by the time he understood what had happened, Warren Whitfield had enough influence in the county to make any local proceeding disappear before it began. She had sealed all of it in a manila envelope with wax. She had pressed it beneath the floorboards of the one place Warren had never cared about and never visited. And she had lived with it for the rest of her life, quietly, patiently, carrying the weight of it alone because she did not know how to set it down without everything collapsing, including herself, until the end. Until she had finally done the only thing left she could do. She had left the key to someone she trusted, someone steady, someone who had spent 40 years walking into the hardest rooms in any building and being the calmest person there. The person who had never once in her life needed someone to tell her she was brave because she had always been too busy being brave to stop and notice. Maggie closed the notebook. She placed it on top of the manila envelope. She set the photograph beside them, and she sat for one more moment in the quiet evening light of 14 Sycamore Hollow Road, in the room where her sister's truth had waited in the dark for decades, patient and exact, and entirely itself. The creek moved outside. The wind shifted in the oaks. And Maggie Calloway, 64 years old, retired nurse widow sister of a dead woman who had loved her enough to leave her, the most dangerous thing she owned, took out her phone and called a lawyer. Janet Cosgrove had practiced law in Cloverdale for 22 years, out of a 2-room office above a dry cleaning shop on Merchant Street. The office smelled permanently of steam and solvent. And the radiator in the front room made a sound every 40 minutes that Janet had once described to a colleague as a small animal dying inside the wall. She had never fixed it. She had more important things to spend money on, and the sound had become so familiar that its absence would have unsettled her more than its presence ever had. She was 61 years old. She had gray hair she did not dye, and reading glasses she wore on a chain around her neck, and a manner of listening to people that communicated without a single word that she had heard worse, and that whatever you were about to tell her was not going to make her flinch. She had seen most of what a small Tennessee town could produce in the way of legal trouble. Disputed estates, neighbor feuds over property lines that had been wrong since the original survey in 1947. Business partners who had shaken hands on things they should have committed to paper, while the handshake still meant something. She was also, and this was the fact that mattered most to Maggie Calloway, one of the few attorneys in Cloverdale who had never taken a single dollar from Warren Whitfield or any of his associated companies. In a town where Warren's money flowed through law offices and charity boards and city council campaigns like groundwater, a lawyer who had kept herself clean of it was either principled or stubborn. Janet Cosgrove was both, and she did not consider those qualities contradictory. Maggie called her from the car parked at the end of the Sycamore Hollow Road driveway in the early dark with the manila envelope and the green notebook on the passenger seat beside her. She had considered waiting until morning. She had considered going home and sleeping on it and approaching the whole thing with the measured calm that had defined her entire adult life. But the truth she had just read in her dead sister's handwriting was not the kind of thing that allowed for a good night's sleep. It was the kind of thing that sat on your chest in the dark and pressed down until you did something about it. Janet answered on the third ring. Maggie spoke for 4 minutes without stopping. She described what she had found beneath the floorboards. The envelope, the notebook, the photograph. She described what the notebook contained. She did not editorialize or speculate or add emotional commentary. She delivered the information the way she had delivered critical patient updates for 40 years, clearly, completely, and with enough clinical precision that the person on the other end could make their own assessment. Janet listened without interrupting. When Maggie finished, there was a brief silence, the silence of a legal mind organizing what it has just heard into categories of evidence and action. Then Janet Cosgrove spoke 4 words that carried no drama, and all of the weight they needed. Come to my office first thing tomorrow morning. Bring everything. Maggie brought everything. She sat across Janet's desk at 8:15 the next morning, while Janet went through the documents with the methodical intensity of someone who understood that the difference between a legal case and a story is documentation. The coffee was the worst Maggie had ever tasted, served in a mug that read, "World's Okayest Lawyer." And she drank 3 cups of it without complaint because the morning was cold, and the office radiator had apparently chosen today to remain silent. Janet made 30 pages of handwritten notes. Her expression traveled through several distinct territories over the course of 3 hours. Careful attention. First, the neutral face of a professional doing due diligence. Then something shifted behind her eyes. A quiet surprise she did not voice, but could not entirely conceal. Then a focused stillness that Maggie recognized from her own career, the particular composure of a person who has understood that the thing in front of them is not routine, that what they are holding carries consequences far beyond this room. Janet set down her pen and removed her reading glasses and looked at Maggie across the desk. "This is real." She did not say it with excitement. She said it the way a radiologist says the word they have been hoping not to say, factually, with the full weight of what it means built into the delivery. The planning board documentation alone would be significant in front of a judge. But the private investigator's report tracing the shell companies back to Warren, combined with Russell Harding's notarized statement confirming what was done to him, that changes this from a historical grievance into something with teeth. Do you know if Harding is still alive? Maggie did not know. Russell Harding had existed in her life only as a name in her dead sister's handwriting. A man she had never met, a love story. She had never been told, a victim of something she had only just learned had happened. He was an abstraction, a figure in a photograph sitting across a table from a young woman who had not yet learned to be afraid. Janet found him in 40 minutes. The databases she used were not the kind that ordinary people had access to, but they were the kind that lawyers in small towns learned to navigate when their clients needed answers that the phone book could not provide. Russell Harding was 79 years old. He lived in a small house outside Murfreesboro, Tennessee, retired, widowed, alive. Janet made the call that afternoon with Maggie sitting 3 feet away. She identified herself, explained the reason for her contact, and delivered a summary of what had been found in language that was precise enough to be credible and careful enough to avoid promising anything that had not yet been verified by a court. The silence on the other end lasted so long that Maggie leaned forward in her chair, certain the connection had dropped. Then a voice came through the phone speaker, old and quiet, and carrying something that Maggie's 40 years of clinical experience allowed her to identify instantly. The specific exhaustion of a man who has been waiting for something so long that the waiting itself has become a kind of identity. I have wondered if this day would ever come. I am 79 years old. I had started to think it would not. He confirmed everything. Every date in the notebook matched his memory. Every detail about the zoning reclassifications, the forced sales, the shell companies that had swallowed his properties one by one, all of it aligned with what he had lived through and had never been able to prove in a forum that mattered. He was willing to speak with an attorney. He was willing to provide testimony, and he had kept his own records. Boxes of them, he said, stored in a closet he had never been able to bring himself to clear out. His wife had asked him once why he did not throw them away. Because the thing that is true does not stop being true just because no one is listening, he had told her. And he had kept them. Maggie and Janet drove to Murfreesboro 3 days later. 2 hours on the highway through the middle of Tennessee in Janet's 10-year-old Honda, which had a crack in the windshield that Janet claimed she had been meaning to fix since the previous administration. They did not talk much during the drive. Both of them understood that what waited at the other end was not a casual meeting, but a reckoning that had been deferred for nearly 4 decades. Russell Harding's house was small and clean and set back from the road behind a front yard that had been carefully maintained. The grass was cut short. A row of boxwood hedges lined the walkway with the geometric precision of someone who found order comforting. It was the house of a man who had lost nearly everything and had responded by keeping whatever remained in perfect condition, as if the act of maintenance itself was a form of resistance against the disorder that had been imposed on his life. He opened the front door before they reached the porch. Tall, thin, white-haired, with eyes that were still sharp beneath the weight of 79 years. He wore a pressed flannel shirt and clean work pants, and he moved with the deliberate economy of a man who had learned to spend his energy carefully, because he no longer had it in unlimited supply. He invited them inside without formality, led them to a kitchen that smelled of coffee he had made by hand, and poured 3 cups without asking how they took it. The living room was spare and clean. A bookshelf against one wall, a few framed photographs on a side table, a woman who must have been his wife, a younger version of himself standing in front of a building he probably used to own. The room had the quality of a space that had been stripped down to only what mattered, not from poverty, but from the particular clarity that comes after you have lost enough to know what is essential and what is decoration. He took them to the bedroom closet. 3 cardboard boxes neatly labeled stacked on the shelf above the hanging rod. He pulled them down one at a time and set them on the bed with the care of a man handling something that had cost him more than anyone in the room could calculate. Records, correspondence, copies of zoning documents, letters from his own attorney at the time, a man who had eventually told Russell that the case was unwinnable because the system he was fighting was not broken, but was functioning exactly as Warren Whitfield intended it to function. Janet went through the first box while Maggie sat beside Russell at the kitchen table. He did not speak quickly or emotionally. He told his story the way a man tells something he has rehearsed alone in his own mind for so many years that the performance has been stripped away entirely, and what remains is only the architecture of fact. Then Janet brought the photograph from the car. She placed it on the kitchen table in front of Russell without comment. He looked at it for a long time. His fingers found the edge of the print and held it with a gentleness that Maggie recognized the gentleness of someone touching something that is both precious and fragile enough to be destroyed by carelessness. When he spoke, his voice had changed. It was quieter. It carried something that went beyond exhaustion into a territory that Maggie, who had sat beside hundreds of people in the worst moments of their lives, could only describe as the sound of a wound that had never fully closed. She was the finest person I ever knew, and I always understood that she did not have a choice. He did not say it with bitterness. He said it with the plain clarity of a man who had spent decades arriving at a conclusion and was now stating it as settled fact. He did not blame Ellie for leaving him. He had never blamed her. What he blamed was the architecture of coercion that had surrounded her. The money, the influence, the slow, invisible closing of every exit, until the only door left open was the one Warren Whitfield had chosen for her. They drove back to Cloverdale in the dark. Janet's hands were steady on the wheel, and her voice was calm when she finally spoke. But what she said carried the particular weight of an attorney who has crossed the line from evaluation into commitment. We have a case, a real one, and we are going to file it. 9 days later, Warren Whitfield found out. Maggie never learned exactly how. Warren had cultivated information channels in Cloverdale the way a farmer cultivates irrigation systematically over decades, until the flow was so natural and so constant that the people feeding it no longer recognized what they were doing as betrayal. They thought of it as conversation, as keeping Warren in the loop, as the ordinary social currency of a town where one man's approval determined the trajectory of careers and contracts and invitations to the right rooms. He appeared at Janet's office without an appointment on a Thursday morning. Janet's assistant, a woman named Colleen, who had worked the front desk for 11 years and had never once been rattled by a visitor, told him that Miss Cosgrove did not take unscheduled meetings and offered to book him for the following week. Warren left without booking. He appeared at Maggie's house that evening. She saw his car from the kitchen window, the silver Mercedes parked in her driveway with the engine running, and for a moment she simply stood at the sink and watched it the way you watch an animal that has wandered into your yard and is deciding whether it is going to be aggressive or simply pass through. Then she dried her hands on the kitchen towel and walked to the front door and opened it before he could knock. She stood in the doorway and did not invite him in. Warren had not come with the smile this time. He had brought a different face, one that Maggie had seen only in glimpses over the years at family gatherings, when a conversation turned in a direction he had not anticipated, when someone failed to defer quickly enough, when the careful machinery of his public self slipped for a fraction of a second, and something else showed through. Tight around the jaw, controlled in the eyes, the face of a man who has assessed a threat and determined that calibrated pressure is the appropriate response. He told her that he knew what she thought she had found, that documents from decades ago proved nothing in a modern courtroom, that the man she was relying on was a bitter failure who had spent 40 years nursing a grudge that should have died of natural causes long ago. He told her she was making a serious mistake, that she would burn through whatever small savings she had on a legal adventure that would end in nothing, and that when the dust settled, he would still be standing where he had always stood, and she would have less than she started with. He spoke for several minutes. He was fluent in this register. The register of a man who has spent a lifetime making reasonable-sounding arguments for conclusions that serve only himself. His voice was measured, his posture controlled, his delivery calibrated to land somewhere between concern and condescension. The precise blend that powerful men deploy when they want to communicate that they are being generous by warning you at all. Maggie listened to every word with the same expression she had brought to every room where someone was projecting authority they did not actually possess. She had spent 4 decades distinguishing between people who were genuinely in command and people who were manufacturing the appearance of command because the situation was already beyond them. Warren Whitfield was manufacturing. The tightness around his jaw was not composure, it was containment. He was afraid and he was working very hard to make sure his fear looked like something else. When he finished, she looked at him steadily across the threshold of her own front door. "I have already told you, Warren. I will be in touch." She closed the door. She stood in her hallway and listened to his footsteps on the front porch, and the car door and the engine starting, and the crunch of gravel as he backed out of her driveway. She listened until the sound disappeared entirely. Then she picked up her phone and called Janet. "File everything. We are done waiting." The civil fraud claims hit the Cloverdale County Court on a Monday morning in February, and by Tuesday afternoon, they had traveled through every conversation in town the way serious things travel in small places. Quickly, completely, and with an energy that made people pause in grocery store aisles and drop their voices to frequencies normally reserved for funerals and scandals. Janet had filed on behalf of Margaret Calloway and in a companion action on behalf of Russell Harding, who had driven up from Murfreesboro with his 3 boxes of documentation and sat in Janet's office for an entire afternoon with the composure of a man who had imagined this moment so many times that the reality of it felt less like a new experience than like a memory finally being lived in the correct tense. The claims alleged that Warren Whitfield had used his position on the county planning board to deliberately engineer zoning reclassifications, targeting Russell Harding's properties, that he had acted in coordination with 2 county officials whose correspondence was preserved in Ellie's sealed envelope, and that the financial benefit he had derived from the subsequent forced sales constituted the fraudulent foundation of his entire real estate empire. The filing requested restitution calculated at current market value for every property Russell had been forced to surrender, plus a comprehensive accounting of all assets derived from those original properties across nearly 4 decades of compounding growth. Warren's legal team filed a motion to dismiss within 72 hours. It was a document that cost more to produce than most people in Cloverdale earned in a month, and it used a great many words to advance 2 arguments. First, that the events in question were too remote in time to be actionable under any applicable statute of limitations. Second, that the documents supporting the claims were unverified, unsworn, and legally insufficient to sustain the burden of proof. Janet's response was 48 pages long and addressed each argument with the unhurried thoroughness of a woman who had been waiting her entire career for exactly this kind of fight. On the limitations question, she invoked the discovery rule, which in Tennessee told the statutory period from the date the injured party discovered or reasonably should have discovered the fraud. The evidence had been sealed in wax beneath the floorboards of a condemned guest house on a back road that had not had running water since 1991. The documents had not been discoverable by any reasonable standard until the moment Maggie Calloway pried open that section of floor. The clock had not started running until the truth came out of the ground. On the question of authenticity, Janet had sent everything to a forensic document examiner in Nashville, a specialist whose testimony had been accepted in state and federal courts across the Southeast for 2 decades. Every document was consistent with its stated date of origin. The ink, the paper, the typeface on the correspondence, the notarial seal on Russell's statement, all of it checked. The examiner's report ran 14 pages and concluded with a single declarative sentence that Janet read aloud to Maggie over the phone with the closest thing to satisfaction that her professional composure would allow. The judge assigned to the case was Harriet Foss, 16 years on the Cloverdale bench, a woman who was known among local attorneys for 2 qualities: a near photographic recall of case law and a constitutional inability to tolerate people who wasted her time. She read both filings, scheduled a hearing, heard oral arguments from both sides, and issued her ruling with the efficiency of a person who had already made up her mind by page 12 of Janet's brief. The court finds the claims sufficiently documented to warrant full proceedings. Discovery will commence immediately. Motion to dismiss is denied. Discovery was where Warren Whitfield's composure began to crack in ways that could not be concealed by expensive attorneys or carefully practiced expressions. His financial records going back 4 decades were subpoenaed. The holding companies and shell entities that Ellie had traced in her notebook were now being retraced by forensic accountants, operating under full legal authority with access to banking records and corporate filings that no private investigator could have obtained. The architecture of concealment that Warren had built over nearly 40 years was being dismantled from the inside by people who had the tools and the legal mandate to take it apart piece by piece. One of the two county officials Ellie had identified in her correspondence had died in 2008. But his son, a man in his 60s who had spent his adult life carrying a vague and unexamined shame about his father, without understanding its source, agreed to meet with Janet. He had found letters in his father's belongings after the funeral. Letters he had never fully read because something about them had made him uncomfortable in a way he could not articulate. He brought them to Janet's office and sat quietly while she went through them and confirmed that they matched the correspondence in Ellie's envelope with textual precision. The story broke publicly on a Thursday when a journalist from Nashville published an article describing the claims in detail. By that evening, 2 television stations had aired segments, and by the following morning, Maggie's phone was ringing with a frequency that would have overwhelmed a person who had not spent 40 years working in environments where the phone never stops, and the only sane response is to triage. She answered Sarah and Kevin and Janet and Russell. Everyone else went to voicemail. Russell called from Murfreesboro in the early evening, his voice carrying the particular quality it had taken on since the filing. Not quite lighter, but looser, as if something that had been clenched for decades was slowly, carefully releasing its grip. He had seen the coverage. He wanted only to say that he was grateful, that he had stopped expecting justice a very long time ago and was still adjusting to the reality that it appeared to be arriving after all. Then Tyler Whitfield called. Maggie was standing in her kitchen when his name appeared on her phone. She had not spoken to her nephew in over a year. Tyler had always been Warren's son in the ways that mattered most, not in appearance, but in orientation, in the direction he faced when making decisions, in the instinctive deference he showed to his father's version of every story. He had grown up inside Warren's gravity and had never developed the escape velocity to leave it. His voice was tight with the particular anger of a person who has been told something about their family that they are not prepared to accept. He told Maggie she was destroying the family, that his father was a good man who had built something real, and that she was tearing it down out of jealousy or grief, or whatever broken motivation had caused her to take a dead woman's ramblings to a courtroom. Maggie let him finish. She had learned decades ago that interrupting an angry person only gives them a reason to escalate. You let the wave hit the shore, and then you speak into the quiet that follows. When Tyler ran out of words, she spoke calmly into the silence. Tyler, I am not destroying this family. I am opening a box that your mother sealed shut because she was too afraid to open it herself. If you want to know the truth, read her notebook. Every word of it is in her handwriting. Every fact in it has been verified. Your mother was many things, but she was never a liar. Tyler did not respond. He ended the call without speaking. Maggie stood in her kitchen holding the phone and thinking about the distance between the boy she had known as a child, who had once fallen asleep on her couch on Thanksgiving, with his shoes still on, and the man who had just told her she was destroying something that was already built on destruction. Jenna did not call, not that week, not the next. But 14 days after the story broke on a Tuesday afternoon, when Maggie was sitting at her kitchen table paying bills, with the focused attention she brought to everything, the doorbell rang, and Jenna Whitfield was standing on the front porch, alone. No coat despite the February cold. Hands clasped in front of her the way her mother used to stand when she was working up the courage to say something she had been thinking about for a long time. Maggie led her inside without questions, made tea, set it on the table. sat across from her niece and waited. Jenna wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at the surface of the tea for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was steady but thin, as if she was rationing her words to make sure each one carried exactly the weight she intended. Was Mom afraid, Aunt Maggie, all those years? Was she afraid? Maggie looked at this young woman, who had her sister's eyes and her sister's habit of looking down when the room felt heavy, and who was asking the only question that actually mattered with a directness that Ellie herself had never been able to manage. Yes, your mother was afraid for most of her life, but at the end, she chose courage over silence. She just had to find a different way to speak. Jenna did not cry. She nodded once slowly and drank her tea, and they sat together in the kitchen for another hour talking about things that were not the case and were not Warren, and were not the past, talking about Jenna's job and about the weather and about a recipe Ellie used to make at Christmas that neither of them could quite remember correctly. It was the kind of conversation that functions as a bridge, not because of what is said, but because of what its existence proves. That connection is still possible, that the damage done by one person does not have to be the final word on a family. Yeah. When Jenna left, she paused on the porch and turned back and looked at Maggie with an expression that contained something Maggie had not seen in any Whitfield face in a very long time: curiosity. The particular curiosity of a person who has begun to suspect that the story they were raised on is not the only version that exists. 3 weeks after the news broke, Warren Whitfield's legal team requested a settlement conference. The public exposure had altered the equation in ways that no amount of legal maneuvering could reverse. Warren's business depended on relationships with partners, lenders, and local government officials, and those relationships were unraveling in real time. The man whose phone calls had once been returned within the hour was now leaving messages that went unanswered. The man whose name on a project had once guaranteed financing was now watching banks conduct reviews they had never previously seen any reason to conduct. The machinery of respectability that had protected him for nearly 4 decades was being disassembled not by the legal system, but by the coverage of what the legal system had uncovered. And Warren Whitfield, who understood leverage better than anyone in Cloverdale, had recognized that the leverage had shifted to the other side of the table. The settlement conference took place on a Tuesday morning in March, in a glass-walled conference room on the 14th floor of an office building in downtown Nashville. The room had been chosen for its neutrality, a space that belonged to neither side, furnished in the anonymous corporate style of places designed to facilitate transactions rather than relationships. Gray carpet, a long oval table, water pitchers with condensation already forming on their sides, and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city with the indifferent clarity of altitude. Maggie arrived at 8:30 with Janet Cosgrove. They had driven up from Cloverdale that morning in Janet's Honda, and Janet had spent the drive reviewing her notes in the passenger seat while Maggie drove, which was a reversal of their usual arrangement, but one that Janet had not questioned because she understood without it being discussed that Maggie needed something to do with her hands during the hour when there was nothing to do but wait. Russell Harding arrived separately. He had driven from Murfreesboro alone 2 hours on the highway in a truck he had owned for 15 years. And he walked into the conference room at 8:45 with the unhurried gait of a man who has waited nearly 4 decades for a morning and is not going to rush the last few minutes of the approach. He wore a pressed shirt and clean trousers, and he carried nothing with him because everything he needed to bring to this room he had already given to Janet in boxes and in testimony and in the quiet accumulation of a lifetime's patience. He sat beside Maggie at the table without ceremony. They did not speak. They did not need to. There is a particular kind of communication that exists between people who are bound together not by history or affection, but by the shared weight of a wrong that was done to both of them by the same hand. And it does not require words. It requires only proximity and the mutual understanding that what is about to happen matters equally to both people present. Warren Whitfield entered at 9 o'clock with 3 attorneys. His lead counsel was a man from Nashville whose hourly rate was, according to Janet's quiet estimate, roughly equivalent to what most people in Cloverdale paid in monthly rent. Warren wore a dark suit and a tie that probably cost more than the table they were sitting at. And he moved through the room with the practiced fluidity of a man who has spent a lifetime entering rooms and expecting them to rearrange themselves around his presence. But something was different. Maggie saw it immediately. Warren's shoulders were set too high. His jaw was held too carefully. The angles of his posture were correct, but the effort required to maintain them was showing through the surface the way cracks show through fresh paint on a wall that is already failing beneath. He sat at the opposite end of the table and placed his hands flat in front of him and looked at Maggie with an expression that was meant to communicate command, but that communicated to a woman who had spent 4 decades reading the distance between what people show and what they feel, something much closer to arithmetic. He was calculating, running the numbers, trying to determine how much this was going to cost him and whether there was still a version of events in which he walked away with most of what he had. His lead attorney opened with a statement about mutual interests and reasonable resolution, and the desire of all parties to bring closure to a matter that had already consumed significant time and resources. The language was careful and smooth, and said absolutely nothing of substance, which was the point. Janet responded with the summary of the claims that took 11 minutes and that she delivered without notes, citing dates and document numbers and financial figures from memory with a precision that visibly unsettled Warren's team. She was not performing. She had simply spent enough hours with the material that it had become part of her, the way a piece of music becomes part of a pianist who has practiced it beyond the point of conscious recall. The first offer came at 9:40. It was in the assessment Janet wrote on the legal pad she slid toward Maggie, beneath the table, a number designed to insult. A figure so far below the documented damages that its only possible function was to test whether the other side would fold early. Maggie read the number. She read Janet's note. She looked across the table at Warren Whitfield and nodded once calmly with the unruffled composure of a woman who has absorbed bad news professionally for 4 decades and has learned that the appropriate response to an insult is not outrage but patience. They sent back a counter. Janet delivered it without inflection, which made it land harder than any emotional appeal could have. The number was specific, documented, and anchored to the forensic accountant's valuation of the original 11 properties at current market rates, adjusted for the decades of income and appreciation that had been built on their fraudulent acquisition. It was not a negotiating position. It was a statement of what the evidence supported, and it sat on the table between the two sides with the immovable weight of a thing that has been calculated rather than wished for. Warren's team withdrew to a side room. 90 minutes passed. Maggie sat at the conference table and drank water and looked out the window at Nashville below and thought about her sister sitting at a kitchen table in Cloverdale, writing in a green notebook by hand because she was too afraid to use a computer. Warren might access documenting the architecture of her own entrapment with the meticulous precision of a bookkeeper who understood that numbers do not lie even when the people who control them do. Warren's team returned with a revised figure. Better, still wrong. The gap between what they were offering and what the evidence demanded was not a matter of reasonable disagreement. It was a measure of how much Warren Whitfield still believed he could control the outcome through the sheer force of having always controlled outcomes before. Another counter. Another withdrawal. The side room absorbed Warren and his attorneys for another hour, while Maggie and Janet and Russell sat at the table and waited with 3 different varieties of patience. Janet's was professional, the patience of an attorney who understood that settlement negotiations are won by the side willing to sit longer. Russell's was historical, the patience of a man who had already waited decades and for whom another hour was indistinguishable from a heartbeat. Maggie's was clinical, the patience of a woman who had sat beside dying patients for hours without checking the clock, because she understood that certain processes cannot be accelerated. and that the only appropriate response is to remain present until they conclude. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, they had been in that glass-walled room for 6 hours. The water pitchers had been refilled twice. The daylight coming through the windows had shifted from morning white to the warmer tones of early afternoon. And Warren Whitfield, who had walked through the door at 9 that morning, with the posture of a man who believed he still occupied the center of every room he entered, was sitting across the table from Maggie, looking diminished in a way that went beyond the physical. The architecture of his certainty, the thing that had filled rooms and silenced doubts, and bent an entire county to the shape of his ambition for nearly 4 decades, was collapsing inward. She could see it in the way his hands no longer rested flat on the table, but had curled slightly, as if they were trying to hold something that was already gone. The final figure was $4.2 million, $2.9 million to Russell Harding, $1.3 million to Margaret Calloway, representing legal costs, the documented value of the evidence Ellie had spent decades assembling, and what Janet had argued in careful, precisely worded terms, constituted recognition of the wrongful conditions under which Eleanor Calloway Whitfield had lived for 38 years, inside a marriage whose foundation was fraud. Warren's team resisted the final element longer than any other, the formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing, to be filed with the court. They argued it was unnecessary. They argued it was punitive. They argued it served no legal purpose beyond public humiliation. Janet listened to each argument and responded to each one with the same 4 words. The evidence supports it. She said it the same way every time, without variation, without emphasis, with the flat factual authority of a person who does not need to raise her voice because the truth is already loud enough. They signed at 3:40 in the afternoon. Warren's pen moved across the acknowledgement with the mechanical efficiency of a hand that has been overruled by the arithmetic of the situation. He did not look at Maggie. He did not look at Russell. He signed and stood and left the room with his attorneys in a formation that resembled retreat dressed up as departure. Russell sat motionless for a full minute after the door closed. Then he stood slowly and walked to the window. He placed one hand on the glass and looked out at the city below, at the roads and the buildings, and the ordinary motion of a world that had gone about its business for nearly 4 decades, while he waited in a small house outside Murfreesboro for something he had almost stopped believing would arrive. He did not speak. Maggie watched him from her chair and understood that what she was witnessing was not celebration. It was the specific private experience of a man who has just been told after decades of silence that what happened to him was real, that it was wrong, that it has been officially, legally, permanently acknowledged. Justice that arrives late does not undo the years that passed without it, but it closes a door that cannot be closed by any other means. And Maggie could see, in the set of Russell Harding's shoulders, and in the way his hand pressed against the glass, as if he needed something solid to confirm that the moment was real, that the door was closing. Maggie thanked Janet quietly, shook hands across the table, rode the elevator down alone. In the lobby of the building, she found a bench near the entrance and sat down. She sat for a long time. The lobby was busy with the foot traffic of a Tuesday afternoon, people moving in and out with briefcases and coffee cups, and the purposeful distraction of lives that had nothing to do with hers. And in the middle of all that ordinary motion, Maggie Calloway allowed herself for the first time since she had opened that floorboard in the bedroom of a forgotten guest house to cry. Not from sadness, not from relief exactly, from the specific wordless feeling of a weight that has been carried so long you have forgotten what your body felt like without it finally and completely set down. She paid Janet's fees first, generously and without negotiation, because Janet Cosgrove had believed her on a cold evening in November, when she had called from a car on a dark back road with a rusted key and a dead sister's notebook, and a story that could have sounded in less careful hands like the grief-distorted fantasy of a woman who was not ready to let go. Janet had not treated her like a grieving woman. Janet had treated her like a client with evidence. That distinction had made everything possible. She set aside funds for Sarah and Kevin, enough that neither of them would ever have to make a decision driven by financial desperation. Not enough to change who they were, just enough to remove the fear of falling that sits beneath every working life like a crack in the foundation, invisible until the weight shifts. She wrote a check to Russell Harding's address in Murfreesboro that exceeded what the settlement had already provided. She enclosed a note on a plain white card. 2 words. From Ellie. She believed he would understand. She believed those 2 words would mean more to him than the number on the check, because what they communicated was not generosity but continuity. That the woman who had loved him and had been taken from him by a force neither of them could fight had never forgotten what he was owed. That she had spent decades quietly building the instrument of his restitution and had entrusted its delivery to the one person she knew would see it through. 6 weeks after the settlement was signed, in the middle of April, a letter arrived at Maggie's house from a law firm in Nashville that she did not recognize. Warren Whitfield was suing her. A counterclaim alleging that the guest house at 14 Sycamore Hollow Road had been improperly distributed through Ellie's will, and that the property rightfully belonged to the Whitfield family estate. Maggie stood in her kitchen reading the letter with the particular calm she reserved for situations that were serious enough to require it. Then she called Janet. Janet's response took less than a minute. She explained that the claim had no legal merit, that Ellie's will had been properly executed, and probated that the guest house had been Ellie's to bequeath under Tennessee law, and that Warren was filing not because he expected to win, but because losing had left him with nothing except the reflex to keep fighting, even when the fight had already been decided. The court dismissed the counterclaim in 2 weeks. The judge's language was brief and unambiguous, and contained, according to Janet, a note of judicial irritation that was the closest thing a formal ruling could come to telling someone to stop wasting the court's time. But the letter had planted something. Not doubt exactly. Something quieter than doubt. A question. Maggie sat alone that evening in the house on Sycamore Hollow Road, which was in the early stages of renovation, surrounded by sawdust and exposed framing, and the particular disorder of a space that is in the process of becoming something new. The electricity was connected, but the walls were still open in places, and the kitchen was not yet functional, and the only light came from a work lamp that Dean Kirkland's crew had left on a sawhorse. She sat on the floor of the bedroom where she had found the hidden compartment and looked at the space beneath the glass panel that Dean had already installed, the shallow cavity, now empty and lit from above, preserved exactly as she had found it. And she asked herself whether the cost of all of this, the legal battles, the family fractures, the public exposure of a dead woman's most guarded secret, whether any of it was worth the wreckage it had created and the wreckage it might still create. She sat with the question for a long time. She did not rush the answer. She had learned over a lifetime of sitting with people in moments of uncertainty that the questions worth asking are the ones that do not resolve quickly, that the urge to answer immediately is usually the urge to stop feeling uncomfortable, and that discomfort, when you let it stay long enough, almost always has something to teach you. The work lamp hummed. The exposed beams of the ceiling cast geometric shadows across the unfinished walls, and Maggie looked at the empty space beneath the glass panel, where her sister's truth had waited in the dark for decades, patient and exact, and she knew the answer. The way she had always known the answers that mattered most, not through reasoning, but through the deep settled certainty of a woman who has spent her entire life trusting her own judgment in rooms where no one else's judgment was available. She was doing the right thing, not because it was easy, not because the outcome was guaranteed, because Ellie had trusted her to do it, and because the truth does not become less true when it is inconvenient, and because a woman who spends nearly 40 years gathering evidence in secret and sealing it in wax and hiding it beneath the floor of a house no one visits does not do so because she wants it to stay hidden. She does so because she is waiting for the right person to come and bring it into the light. Dean Kirkland began the renovation in earnest that same month. He was a contractor who had been working in Cloverdale for 30 years. and who had been recommended to Maggie by 3 separate people using identical language. Honest, thorough, incapable of cutting a corner even when cutting it would save time and money, and nobody would ever notice. He walked through 14 Sycamore Hollow Road with the evaluative patience of a man who understood old buildings the way some people understand old people, not with pity, but with respect for what they had survived. "The bones are good," he told Maggie on his first walkthrough. "Old wood holds when it has been left alone. The pine floors beneath the grime and the fallen tiles and the decades of neglect were sound. The framing, though exposed in places where the siding had rotted away, was structurally intact. The foundation poured in the early 1960s by men who overbuilt, because that was what they knew how to do, had not shifted more than an inch in 60 years. We can work with this." They worked with it for 4 months. Maggie had made one decision early and held to it without compromise. She wanted the house restored, not replaced. She was not interested in a renovation that erased what the building had been in order to create something modern and unrecognizable. She wanted the old kept where the old could be kept, and the new introduced only where the old had failed beyond recovery. The porch was rebuilt using wood that matched the original as closely as Dean could source, which required 3 weeks and a supplier outside Knoxville who specialized in reclaimed lumber from barns built in the same decade. The roof was repaired with materials that respected the original pitch and profile. The windows were reglazed in their original frames by a man Dean knew who had been doing that kind of work since the 1970s, and who drove down from Cookville with his tools in a truck older than the house itself. The siding was replaced board by board, only where rot had made the existing boards structurally unsafe, and cleaned and repainted where it had not. Inside, the pine floors were stripped back to bare wood and refinished to a warm honey color that made every room feel as though it was lit from below by something quieter and more permanent than electricity. The kitchen was rebuilt entirely, and at Maggie's specific request, Dean sourced yellow tiles that matched the originals as closely as the modern supply chain would allow. It took him 2 months to find them. He contacted tile shops across Tennessee and into Georgia, sent photographs of the surviving originals, and was told repeatedly that the specific shade and glaze had not been manufactured since the late 1960s. He eventually found a small ceramics workshop outside Chattanooga that could produce a custom batch by hand, glazed to match the color from the photographs Maggie had taken of the tiles that had survived. It cost more than the rest of the kitchen combined. Dean told Maggie this, and Maggie told Dean to order them. Warm, stubborn yellow, the color of a thing that refuses to surrender, no matter how many decades it has been overlooked. Some things are worth what they cost. Maggie herself spent weekends at the house during the renovation, working alongside Dean's crew in ways they had not expected, and quickly learned not to question. She stripped wallpaper in the sitting room by hand, standing on a stepladder for hours, with a spray bottle and a putty knife peeling back layer after layer of pattern, until she reached the bare plaster beneath which was cracked but solid. She sanded the window frames on the porch, until her arms ached working the grain back to smoothness with a patience that was not decorative but structural. The patience of a woman who understood that restoring a thing properly means attending to the parts that no one will see. In the bedroom where Maggie had found the compartment, the iron bed frame was cleaned of rust and returned to its original position. The glass panel in the floor remained set flush with the refinished boards covering the original cavity that had been preserved exactly as she had found it. Empty now, but intact. Beside it, mounted on the wall at eye level in a simple frame, a card in Maggie's own handwriting. Here is where the truth was kept. Here is where the waiting ended. Tyler Whitfield arrived unannounced on a Saturday afternoon in June, 2 months after the settlement. Maggie heard a car on the gravel that Dean's crew had relayed along the driveway and walked to the porch expecting it to be a delivery. Tyler stood beside a sedan that was not his father's and looked at the house with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not the anger of the phone call, not the closed defensiveness she had come to associate with the Whitfield version of his features. Something more open than either of those. Something that looked from the distance of the porch like exhaustion that had finally stopped pretending to be something else. He walked to the porch steps. She waited. He stood at the bottom and looked at her, and then looked at the house again, at the new porch rails and the repainted siding, and the windows that no longer filtered the light through decades of grime. And he said quietly in a voice stripped of performance, "I read Mom's notebook. Janet gave me a copy." Maggie did not respond immediately. She let the silence hold. She had learned that the most important sentences people speak are usually preceded by a silence that they need someone to protect rather than fill. "I do not know what to do with what I know about my father now." Tyler's voice carried the specific weight of a man who has discovered that the ground he built his life on was laid by someone who did not care whether it would hold. "I do not know how to be his son, and also know this." Maggie looked at her nephew standing at the bottom of the porch steps of a house that his mother had used to hide the evidence of his father's corruption. And she did not offer comfort or analysis or the kind of reassuring words that people reach for when they want to make a difficult moment pass more quickly than it should. She offered him the only thing she had ever been any good at offering: the truth delivered without padding. You do not have to know what to do with it right now. You only need to know that your mother loved you, and that the truth is not your enemy, even when it changes what you thought you knew. Tyler did not stay long. He walked through the house without speaking, pausing in the bedroom to look at the glass panel in the floor and the framed card on the wall. He stood there for a long time. When he turned to leave, he stopped at the front door and looked back at Maggie. "The house looks good." That was all he could manage. Maggie understood that it was enough. That for a man whose entire understanding of his family had just been rebuilt from the foundation, acknowledging that something broken was becoming beautiful was as close to acceptance as he could get today. And today was all anyone could ask for. Jenna came 2 weeks after Tyler. She arrived on a weekday morning unannounced like her brother, but where Tyler had stood at the bottom of the steps and needed to be met. Jenna walked straight up to the porch and sat down in one of the two chairs Maggie had placed there the week before. And she waited with the quiet certainty of someone who has decided she belongs in a place and does not need permission to be there. Maggie brought out 2 cups of coffee and sat beside her, and they looked out at the oak trees and the creek together in a silence that was not empty but full. The kind of silence that exists between people who have passed through something difficult and come out on the same side. After a while, Jenna spoke. She said she had been thinking about what Maggie had told her in February about Ellie choosing courage over silence. She said she had been turning it over in her mind for months, and she had come to understand something about her mother that she had never understood while Ellie was alive. That her mother's quietness had not been weakness, that her mother's distance had not been indifference, that her mother had been carrying something so heavy and so dangerous that the only way to protect the people she loved was to keep them at arm's length from the truth until she could find a safe way to deliver it. "I used to think she did not love us enough to fight," Jenna said, her voice steady in the morning air. "Now I understand she loved us too much to fight the wrong way." Maggie set her coffee down. She looked at her niece, who had her sister's eyes and her sister's quiet depth, and who had just articulated something about Ellie that Maggie herself had felt but had never been able to put into words. And she reached over and took Jenna's hand, and they sat together on the porch of 14 Sycamore Hollow Road while the creek ran below, and the wind moved through the oaks, and the house restored and warm and finally telling the truth about what it had always been held them both. Maggie moved into 14 Sycamore Hollow Road in August, not because she had to. The house on the other side of Cloverdale was still hers, paid off and comfortable and full of 30 years of living with Frank. She could have stayed there. She could have used the settlement money to buy something larger, or newer, or more convenient. But Maggie Calloway had never once in her life made a decision based on convenience, and she was not going to start now. She chose the guest house because it was where her sister had finally told the truth, and she believed with the unscientific certainty of a woman who had spent 4 decades trusting instincts that had never been wrong when it mattered that places hold the energy of what happens in them. She wanted to live inside that particular energy for whatever year she had left. The energy of a secret that had been kept in the dark for decades and had finally, through patience and courage and the stubbornness of a truth that refused to die, found its way into the light. Sarah drove down from Nashville the first weekend after Maggie moved in. She stood in the restored kitchen, running her hand along the yellow tiles, with an expression that forced Maggie to look away for a moment. Because it was Ellie's expression. The same tenderness, the same quiet devastation at the beauty of a thing that almost did not survive. Mom, Aunt Ellie would have loved this. And Maggie, standing in the kitchen her sister had never seen restored, but had trusted someone to restore, answered with the only words that felt accurate. I know. I think she does. Kevin came the following weekend with his wife and their 2 small children, who ran across the refinished pine floors in their socks, and spent the afternoon attempting to build a dam across the creek with sticks, which the creek dismantled with the indifferent persistence of water that has been doing what it does for longer than any human argument can sustain. Kevin stood on the rebuilt porch in the early evening, while his children's voices carried up from the creek bed, and the last light of a Tennessee summer moved through the oak trees in long gold columns. He spoke quietly, almost to himself, the way people speak when they are saying something they have only just finished understanding. I used to wonder why you were never afraid of anything. Now I think I understand. It is not that you are not afraid. It is that being afraid has never once stopped you from walking into the room. Maggie thought about that for a long time afterward. She thought about it while she watered the garden she had planted along the creek bank. She thought about it while she sat on the porch in the evenings and listened to the water and the wind and the particular silence of a place that has been given back its dignity. She thought Kevin was right, and she thought Ellie had been the same way at the end. Not unafraid, never unafraid, but unwilling to let fear be the final word she wrote. The notebook, the sealed envelope, the rusted key left to the right person. Those were not the acts of a woman who had surrendered. They were the acts of a woman who had decided that the truth deserved a future, even if she herself would not be there to witness its arrival. Margaret Calloway was 64 years old when she inherited a forgotten guest house that an entire room had agreed was worthless. She was 65 when she stood on its restored porch and understood what her sister had actually left her. Not money, though money had come. Not justice, though justice had arrived in a glass-walled room in Nashville on a Tuesday afternoon in March, and had settled into place with the quiet finality of a door closing on a chapter that had been open for far too long. What Ellie had left her was something that could not be measured in dollars or legal judgments or settlement agreements. She had left her proof. Proof that the truth, however long it waits, however deep it is buried, however many powerful men build their comfort on top of it and assume it will never surface, does not disappear. It waits, patient and exact and entirely itself. And when the right person finally comes with the right key and the willingness to look, it rises every single time. If this story moved something in you, if you have ever been handed the broken piece, the forgotten thing, the inheritance that made the room laugh, then you already understand what Margaret Calloway understood standing in that overgrown driveway on a cold November afternoon with a rusted key in her hand and nothing left to lose. That what looks like nothing is sometimes everything. That the people who underestimate you are counting on you to agree with their assessment. And that the truth your loved ones carried, however quietly, however long, is never truly lost, as long as someone who loves them is still willing to look. Leave one word in the comments that describes what you would do if you were handed a key to something everyone else had already dismissed. Share this story with someone who is carrying something heavy right now. Someone who needs to remember that silence is not the same as surrender. and that sometimes the people who love us most leave us exactly what we need, hidden exactly where we will find it when we are finally ready. Because dreams do not age, and neither does the truth.